Hey, Lisa.
Hey.
Good to see Lisa and Danny. It's been a while that we've all been together, albeit virtually.
It's been at least like maybe what, 2.5 years?
Time flies,
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, speaking from the middle forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lisa and I did that. Annie, you were in that lineup too, yeah? I can't remember.
I was. That was 3 years ago, maybe.
2018,
Yeah, Annie was doing serious, what was it? The FU auntie or whatever.
Oh yeah, that's
in
right.
our group picture.
That was a blast after the reading. At the Bishop, all right.
Yeah.
All right. I got us going.
Hey, Tony.
Good evening, folks. My name is Tony Brewer, and I represent the Writers Guild of Bloomington. And along with Kyle Quass, our technical director, and co-host and co-producer Joan Hawkins, we produced this spoken word series, the Writers Guild Spoken Word Series. We began 5 years ago in person here in Bloomington, Indiana. We moved virtually, moved online last May, and this is our 1-year anniversary of doing this thing online. So we're happy you could all join us. We are sponsored in part by the Indiana Arts Commission, the Bloomington Arts Commission, and the Bloomington Urban Enterprise Association. The Writers Guild of Bloomington wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University and the city of Bloomington were built on indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We are thrilled to be observing Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, which is the month of May, and we're thrilled to have 4 amazing performers tonight: David Mura, ANNI LIU, Danny Nyugen, and Kyoko Kiramura. We also are doing a Q&A, quick Q&A after the performances tonight. So if you have a question, be sure and put it in the chat if you're with us on Zoom, or if you're out there on Facebook Live, put it in the comments and we hope to get to it. Sometimes it's a little hard to follow things in the chat or on Facebook, darting back and forth between screens, but we will get there. I just had a couple of announcements, a couple of things I wanted to say before we get to our performers this evening. Third Sunday Right is our ongoing workshop, the Writers Guild ongoing workshop. Third Sunday Right offers all writers a chance to share in a writing community and to flex and tone their writing muscles through exercises and discussion. This is an ongoing online workshop, although we have met in person in the past and hope to do so again in the future. If you're interested in receiving monthly prompts and having a friendly place to share your writing responses and read the work of others, contact Shauna Ritter. Her email address is on our website to get invited to a private Facebook group. Also want to mention our monthly business meeting for the Writers Guild of Bloomington is Saturday, May 22nd at 3 p.m. via Zoom, and you can contact the Guild for the link. All of this info and more is available on our website, which is writersguildbloomington.com, all one word, writersguildbloomington.com. There's also an opportunity for you to sign up for our newsletter. Joan Hawkins does a fantastic job putting together a wonderful, informative, and lively newsletter. So do yourself a favor to sign up for that. We're also active on all of the outlets. Like us, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We got a YouTube channel. You got to mash that like button and ding the little bell to make sure you get updates on everything we are doing. Also wanted to mention that we will be back next month, Wednesday, June 2nd, featuring poet Ken Yoshikawa and 2 poets from the Southern Fried Poetry Slam, actually the president of Southern Fried Poetry Slam and lead organizer Sarita Sincere Goods and Adam Henze. Also music by local bard Travis Pontarelli. I think that is enough for me. So First off, we want to have a little bit of music by our first performer this evening, Kyoko Kiramura. She is a vocal improviser, band leader, and composer based in Brooklyn. She leads her ensemble Tide Pool Fauna, featuring saxophonist Ingrid Labrock, bassist Ken Filiato, and drummer Dayon Sayok. She co-leads Geometry with Taylor Ho Bynum, Joe Morris, and Tamika Reed, and is an active side person with recent appearances on albums by William Parker, Corey Smythe, and Russ Lossing, for which she has garnered stellar reviews. Kiramura is also known for her decade-long association with musician and composer Anthony Braxton and is featured on many of his releases. Would you please welcome Kyoko Kiramura?
Hi. It moves. It flows. It stops. It grows, a precious thing so fickle and sweet. It's in your head, in your heart, eating you inside out, alive. It's here again. It calls your name, laughing while you run, hide, deny you. You thought you were safe. This time around, you led yourself to believe what could have been. It moves, it flows, it stops. It grows, precious thing so fickle and sweet. It's in your head, in your heart, eating you inside out, alive. It's here again. It calls your name, laughing while you run, hide, deny. You thought you were safe. This time around, you let yourself believe what could have been. La la li oh no ma me ay ya de la di pon de la vida pa de ro pe do de ro e ba do la di pa.誰も知らない街に行こう君にさよなら 窓の外を伝う雫がそっと消えてくお日様さしてる国に行こう君はもういない小さな踏切越えたところの駅で降りよう雫がそっと消えてく
Is it me now?
Wonderful. Thank you, Kyoko. Fantastic. Sorry, I'm just looking at screens here, trying to make sure everyone that wants the Zoom link has it and is in here with us. And I think you're all here. So let us have our first reader for this evening. Annie Liu is a writer, editor, and translator with work featured in Ploughshares, Ecotone, the Georgia Review, Two Lines, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from Indiana University and works at Graywolf Press. Winner of the Lexi Rudnitsky Prize from Persea Books. Her first book will be published in 2022. Annie.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks so much to the Writers Guild for having me back. And I'm really excited to share this space. I'm really grateful for the beautiful music that Kyoko already shared. I was, yeah, it's tough to follow in some ways, but thank you. My first reading with the Writers Guild, I think was maybe 5 years ago, and I had just started translating. And so I was thinking about that, and also recently thinking a lot about how much translating has taught me about writing, but also just about sort of like steadiness and process and patience. So I'm going to share a few poems by a poet named Duya, who is still the one poet who I've really continued translating from when I first started. And I feel like her work has really kind of burrowed into my own creative DNA quite a bit. We're both very nostalgic, her for her childhood, I think, even because she still lives in her native Henan. She moved back to her home province, I think, after living in Beijing for some time. And I think I'm also homesick for China, where I was originally born and raised, but also, yeah, I think for something beyond that too, maybe for like a time rather than a place. And I've been thinking about Dami Che. She has this great line in, I forget which book, but she talks about homesickness as a method. And I think that is sort of something, maybe a theme that runs through the work I'm going to share tonight. The first poem is called Wind in Woods. Wind blows in, bringing signs of rain. The woods darken, rustle, then settle back into silence. Woods shrouded and dim, as if a place to be, as if the center of all the things of the world. In its shadowed hush, memory flares. Here are the changes of the ages, its continuation, and the impermanence of all that live in time. It is from here that speech begins. This next one, sort of seasonally appropriate, is Spring in My Village. Spring in my village. Stranger, this is spring in my village. From the very start, the east wind has opened every enclosure, occupying each street corner and patio, moving through the village locust trees to the fields beyond. In every courtyard, a poplar and an elder. Through winter storms, the old folks huddled in doorways, waiting for spring. Now they lean against the low wall, comforted by sun, recalling the past. They never seem to know where I've gone. On the way out of the village, poplar catkins cover the ground. They are our first flowers of spring, and soon the blooms of paulownia, pear, and willow will carpet the roads. If you come in April, you will see drifts of snow-white locust blossoms, and perhaps the white funeral flags marching down the road. From the gate, you can see the newly dug graves in the field. Later, when red, yellow, and white flowers bloom in this same field, you'll almost believe they never wither or die. Bit by bit, the air inside the courtyards warm, fill with fragrance. This much the farmers and I have always known, because when it's spring in my village, stranger, the east wind will have blown open every enclosure. And this last one for my first set is called River. In spring of the year I turned 20, I looked for a river calm and wide that I believed to be my past incarnation. Since childhood, I've seen it many times, in the blink of an eye, in dreams, but I could only glimpse it in flashes before it faded back into nothing. River flowing alone across the earth, what moonlit nights and sun-bright days has it drifted past? To which hills, trees, or villages has it given its light? What months and years have since carried it away, not to return? Bright river forever disappearing, I never found it. That spring, I walked the banks of countless rivers, but they were not the one from before. They did not know the bleakness of my life. Casting warm waves, flowing gently, it is like moonlight from a past life, like home, but it is a constant farewell. The more I approach, the farther it recedes. Many years have passed since that spring. I see now that I've been split in two, one of me in this world, reading, writing, sleeping, and the other walking to this day along that faraway river. Thanks.
Thanks, Annie. And welcome back. Good to have you back. And I'm glad Lisa Kwong could make it to the one of your former hosts could make it in the Zoom tonight. Next, let's have David Mura. David Mura's newest book is A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing. He has written 4 books of poetry, The Last Incantations, Angels for the Burning, The Colors of Desire, which won the Carl Sandburg Award, and After We Lost Our Way, winner of the National Poetry Contest. His 2 memoirs are Turning Japanese, Memoirs of a Sansei, New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and Oakland Penn Josephine Miles Book Award, and Where the Body Meets Memory, an Odyssey of Race, Sexuality, and Identity. His novel, Famous Suicides of the Japanese Empire, was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award, the John Gardner Fiction Prize, and Virginia Commonwealth University Cabell First Novelist Award. He also helped start the Twin Cities Community Arts Organization, the Asian American Renaissance, and served as its artistic director. Please welcome David Mura.
Hello. It's good for me to be here. I'm going to read a poem. It's called Poem to Abdi. I live in the Twin Cities, which has a large Somali American population. And as a Japanese American, I'm very conscious of the issues that they face. My son had a friend named Abdi, I've changed the name for this poem, who was shot outside a local rec center. And my son was working with Abdi on a hip hop album. And so this is about what happened after Abdi was shot. So this is called Poem to Abdi, and it's set in Minneapolis. 10:35. Gnats and mosquitoes blurring street lights in the parking lot of the Coyle Rec Center. And Abdi smoking, chilling, just after the lights slipped away on this near solstice. And the lines he's on fleek flow through that girl he passed at the Mall of America. The apartment he'll go back to without his mother, returned to Mogadishu to aid his dying poet father, heart failing without metaphor. And Abdi thinks, tomorrow I'll be breaking Ramadan. As the beats my son's Nico laid down for him start to jump. My brain ain't neurological, beyond ecological. I've torched the devil's follicles, stroking his blood-red tail, thinking where we failed and where a bullet sails, looking late for Ismail. 3 shots. Pop, pop, pop. Here's only the first behind him. In his head, his lines that girl, Ismail, his mother, and the fast off Ramadan all explode from his skull into the June night as he topples. And suddenly there's 2 black brothers over him, smashing at his chest, and he's not even thinking, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And the light, street light above burns fluorescence into his retina, gnats, mosquitoes, a strange yellow glow just before the red. The red, the red, the red. And he'll never witness his brother, his sister Jamila, his friends Yasmin and Khadijah, and my son Nico hunkered in the waiting room as the surgeons huddled 2 hours to undo what can't be undone. And 3 days later, Nico stands with Abdi's friends and family. The mother just returned from Somalia, his father dying, still unable to fly. And there is no coffin to cover his sleeping face. As he's lowered 2 graves from Yasmin's brother, and as my son grips his shaking girlfriend, and as he looks at Abdi's mother, the only Somali mother who ever accepted him, he says, even loved him, he thinks of the track Abdi and he jammed on, the album they'd planned. And how just hours earlier at work, when he told his boss of his friend's death, his boss shot back, yeah, well, that's what you get for hanging around with those people. And how did they get to be my son's people? And how am I to comfort my son, weeping before me now in my study, or chastise him for using my wife's credit card to help buy Abdi's mother's plane fare and a bus ticket for another friend to leave for Fargo so he doesn't become one more Abdi? My son saying he looked at the mother's face falling into her son in the grave, and he wanted to rip the clouds from the sky, rip his boss's hair from their follicles, cut the tracks in their album that will never be finished, and the kids in school shouting at Abdi, "Look at me, I'm the captain," and "Hey, Mohammed, suicide bomber." And my son saying, "I can't believe he's dead, Dad. I can't take it in." And I'm holding him, as Abdi will never be held by his mother, or his father, the poet, dying in Mogadishu. And I can't say I hate this world as much as you, Nico, though that too is in my heart. And so I say, his life was not his death. Your friendship was not his death. His music was not his death. And so I say, listen, he's still rapping. Those lines are still there. He's still talking to you. What is he saying? And Nico, as his body shakes in my arms, he'd want me. He'd want me to be happy. And I see Abdi's face standing beside us. And I tell him, thank you, Abdi. Thank you for loving my boy. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful. Our final reader in this first round is Danny Nguyen. Danny has published stories and personal essays in The Offing, The Journal, Gulf Coast, Fog Lifter, and elsewhere. They have been awarded fellowships and grants from Ragdale Foundation, Ragdale Foundation, Lambda Literary, Kundiman, and San Francisco Arts Commission. Her column on BDSM kink culture appears in the international fetish social network platform Recon and is translated into 5 languages. Danny.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Hey, folks. Lovely to see everyone. It's been about 2.5 years since I've been in Bloomington, and I'm still not in Bloomington, but it's lovely to be beamed in there. Let's see. So I'm going to actually read one half of an essay for this first round, and I'll finish it in the second round. So you'll get like part 1 and part 2. Let's see. I've been thinking a lot about, April 30th in the United States is a date that we typically call the Fall of Saigon, and it's when the US pulled out of Southeast Asia after bombing and causing a lot of havoc. And it's one of the reasons why the Southeast Asian diaspora even happened. And how my family ended up in the United States. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm working on a first book project, and it's a memoir told in essays, primarily looking at the ways in which inheriting community from my elders, my Vietnamese elders who, were displaced, and how that parallels or is similar and different to my experience inheriting community from queer folks and sexual radicals who survived the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. So yeah, and how is that affecting my experience with intimacy in all its many forms? So this is an essay that was published last year, and I'm adapting it for the collection now, called After the Honeymoon Phase. So first half of After the Honeymoon Phase. Co-ed call girls, baby monitor, sound of fear. Mother, may I sleep with danger. These were the titles of many fine selections of made-for-TV movies that aired on the Lifetime channel. My best friend Danae and I obsessed over as children. Though the hyperbolic titles were amusing enough, it was the characters that fascinated us most. In My Stepson, My Lover, a woman has an affair with her husband's son from another marriage after discovering her husband lied about wanting to start a family. In Twisted Desire, Melissa Joan Hart fucks an ex-con in her parents' bed, convinces the guy to kill said parents, then rats him out to the cops in an elaborate ruse to get back with her ex-boyfriend, all because mommy and daddy wouldn't let her go to a concert. Indeed, the citizens of these made-for-TV movie universe, with their excess of face-slapping and blazing house fires, seemed cursed to only make bad decisions. And as angsty teenagers, watching them made Danae and I feel better about ourselves. Because I was a gothed out punk kid and Danae was constantly transferring between schools, we weren't particularly popular high school students. We were never invited to drunken parties hosted by wealthy, pretty teens whose parents left them alone for the weekend in a multi-story home complete with swimming pool, expensive sound systems, and cabinets filled with OxyContin. So we occupied our times talking on the phone, staying up late into the evening, trading movie recommendations the ways others gossiped about their friends. Have you seen No One Would Tell? I asked into the receiver. It's the one where Candace Cameron dates a high school wrestling star played by Fred Savage who beats her and ends up killing her. Oh my God, yes, Danae gushed. There's also that movie where Tiffany Amber Thiessen plays a small town slut who gets raped by a football player and no one believes her, not even her own mother. It's called She Fought Alone because she has to fight the town alone. These were the lives of the other students at our school, Danae and I speculated. This is what we were missing out on. As far as we were concerned, these films gave us temporary passes to enter our peers' natural habitat and observe them like animals from a safe distance. To me, Lifetime movies were like fables, fantastical 2-hour tales that imparted important morals to live by. The Three Little Pigs teaches us that putting in hard work will result in something sturdy that can withstand catastrophe. Cinderella espouses that being persistent and virtuous will help you triumph over oppression. And Death of a Cheerleader taught me that you should never kill anyone, even if they are an asshole in the form of Tori Spelling. Despite our mutual love of the art form, Danae and I gravitated towards two different types of made-for-TV movies. I favored those about teens in crisis, while she preferred stories of the women in peril variety. From mothers who married serial killers to chemistry teachers being stalked by their students, Danae was inspired by these women's resilience against victimhood, often literally screaming and clawing against all obstacles. But whereas I saw these films as cautionary, Danae romanticized them. She didn't simply normalize the love life of a woman in peril, she held it up as a standard to strive by. In the 8th grade, she wrote a manifesto outlining her future marriages and subsequent divorces. Her first husband would be wealthy and forfeit half of his fortune upon their separation. Her second husband would be an exotic foreigner, providing her with equally beautiful children. And while the third and final husband would be young, pretty, dumb, and did whatever she commanded. As we grew up, Danae never managed to turn this childhood dream into an adult reality, though her predilection for the dramatic remained. She pursued a career in corporate sales while I, partially inspired by my love of teens in crisis, worked as a mental health care counselor. We were sitting in a cafe discussing the latest gripes of our respective jobs when she solicited my advice for her most recent romantic endeavor. Two of my coworkers are really into me, she said. They're both best friends and roommates, and they don't want the other to know. Which one should I sleep with first? Neither, I said. Don't complicate things like that. If you want to move past the sexual tension, you should either avoid them or directly communicate what your boundaries are. Sipping on her latte, Danae considered my words. 2 weeks later, over lunch, she spoke of a fist fight that had broken up between the two men because she had fucked them both. I wasn't sure if it was a bad idea or not, she said in her defense. I sighed and shook my head at her incorrigibility, saying that only television characters acted this way. This had become our ritual. Danae would seek guidance for problems I thought of as having easy answers, then ignore what I had to offer. Yet, as annoying as this pattern became, I would be lying if I didn't admit our dynamic gave me a sick sense of importance. After all, my friend came to me, of all people, for advice because I was the expert. I was the smart one who could see the big picture of what constitutes healthy behavior. I worked for a health service nonprofit organization that barely paid its employees more than the monthly government assistance checks that our chronically homeless clients survived on. Our office featured a free clinic, a drop-in center that had to be regularly fumigated due to bedbug infestations, and was located in a rough San Francisco neighborhood where pedestrians were on constant alert of stepping in human feces littering the sidewalk. For professional development, my boss sent me to trainings and seminars led by seasoned mental health care providers. The male instructors were always in three-piece suits to project authority, and the women invariably wore hemp pants with stacks of beaded jewelry to give an air of granola. I was taught an arsenal of techniques to use when working with clients: cognitive behavior therapy, motivational interviewing, trans-theoretical model of change. Even if I didn't fully comprehend what I was doing, the emphatic jargon made me at least feel intelligent. During a group training, on working with clients with histories of abuse, my instructor, Amanda, gestured towards a circular diagram divided into quadrants projected onto the wall. Her bangles clinked as they slid down her wrist while she carefully plotted her words with chamomile-soaked tranquility. "This is the cycle of abuse," she said. "It typically follows these 4 stages. First is the tension building. Then there's the incident where the abuser violently acts out physically or verbally or psychologically. Third is the reconciliation between the abuser and the abused. Then comes stage 4, calm, or what we call the honeymoon phase." As a counselor, I held one-on-one sessions with clients in rooms with cushioned furniture, surrounded by motivational posters pinned to the walls as a white noise machine whirled outside the door. I worked with a young transgender transient to identify the barriers that were preventing her from leaving survival sex work. I helped a crystal meth addict process the complicated reasons he medicated with the drug, how it made the world shift to a comfortable distance, blurred his intrusive thoughts, and muted his self-loathing so he could finally feel confident enough to experience intimacy. The communication and solution-finding tools I used with my clients translated well into my personal life, because if Danae was hell-bent on whipping up as much drama with her lovers, I would have none of it with mine. Between how guarded Lifetime movies made me and the holistic philosophies of my work, I'd somehow managed to coast through my 20s on a winning streak of deceptively healthy-ish long-term relationships. I would date a man for years, employing my conflict resolution skills to settle disputes through de-escalation, amicably winding down the relationship when we mutually came to the understanding that things wouldn't work out due to issues that no one was at fault for. An acceptance into law school in San Diego gave Jorge the opportunity to be closer to his family in Mexico. The death of David's father forced him to move in with his widowed mother and care for her. Chris, newly laid off, needed to lean into his midlife crisis and the possibilities of radical change, so I wished him luck on his next adventure. I exercised empathy to the point of compersion. Unlike Danae, I was able to gloat about maintaining a friendly relationship with all my exes. And then there was Coy. And I'm going to stop there and continue later.
That's great, Danny. Thanks so much. Let us now have a musical interlude. We will return to Kyoko Kiramura. I want to remind everyone that we are going to do a Q&A at the end of the readings and performances this evening. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or put it in the comment section on Facebook Live. Let's hear now from Kyoko Kiramura.
I am so enjoying listening to everybody, and it's the stories are just pulling me in. And the first two songs that I did this evening were with words. They were from a while ago. And then I started working without words because I speak 3 languages, but I also feel like I don't communicate well in any of them. And this one is a new piece that I'm working on now where I take syllables apart. And this is, I'm taking apart syllables for the words identity, which interestingly doesn't have a Japanese equivalent. It could be jikoishiki. And then I also speak French, so identité. And then community, nakama, communauté. So the syllables are actually sort of broken apart. And that's how I built this next song. I jam. Eden iritko makdanono. And you shika. Tia kira tete me kom ki kishna e. Muika shini. Ne ma ot now na do tide etche din love sick dive. Ir nap jim nap de me din ni ko kamade dan And you mushika ni te wa kiamte I kamikish. Kishna ete marikashini Nemot na maditum say
drinking from the river, chasing silver bubbles as they float away grass, reaching out to consume me, weaving silent darkness. He came to me at the end of the century, a merman caught off the shores of Gowanus Bay. Half a man, mostly fish, the mackerel without a name. Did not speak, read or write, but understood supply and demand, the praise he could command. So this is all I have for this song about a merman, half man, half fish. And it's based on a legend of a merman that was caught not too far from here in the Gowanus Bay. And about a couple of blocks east from where I am right now is the Gowanus Canal, which is a Superfund site that is being redeveloped and cleaned up. And the merman apparently was caught like in the 1850s, and it's always really intrigued me, you know, of how people react to something they may, when they encounter something they feel may be alien or does not belong in quote unquote their group. And then juxtaposed with the fact that it's heavy gentrification going on in this area of Brooklyn. And it's a super fun site. They want to clean it up. There are developers coming in. People are pushing back. Residents are being, pushed out. All that is super intriguing. So there's another song that I wrote before about the merman, which was choreographed by the dancers of Mark Lamb Dance, because I love working with dancers. And then, I thought I was done with the merman, but then he came, it was like sometimes characters from my old song will come back, and then I'll end up writing about it. But this is all I have for him right now, and I'll just give it a clean ending this time so that we can move on. Thank you.
Sorry, you caught me writing something in the chat there. That was wonderful, Kyoko. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Everyone's just knocked out here. Let's return to our three readers. I believe David Mura is up first in our second round. David?
So I said earlier, I'm a Japanese American. I'm a third generation. And so my parents' families were interned during World War II. And America is now going through this thing where they are failing to distinguish between Asians in Asia and Americans of Asian descent. And that's what happened to my entire community during World War II. So this is, they rounded up the leaders of the Japanese American community even before the internment orders. And so this is one of the leaders who's kept in a separate camp from his family, is writing to his wife. He mentions his friend Matsuo, who's bruised because sometimes the Japanese Americans even argued and sometimes even fought about how to respond to the internment. And his friend plays a biwa, which is a Japanese stringed instrument. And this man owned a greenhouse like my grandfather. So the poem is called Letters from an Internment Camp, and he's writing to his wife in another camp. Dear Michiko, do songs sound different in prison I think there are more spaces between the words. I think when the song ends, the silence does not stop singing. I think there is nothing but song. Matsuo's back, his bruises almost healed, a tooth missing. His biwa comes out again with the stars, a nightly matter. He sends his regards. Do you get fed these putrid gray beans? I hope you haven't swallowed too many of them. They put my stomach in a permanent revolt, shouting, no emperor should ever feed his people so harshly. I agree. Let's you and I grow skinny together. Let's keep the peace. Any second, the lights will go out. I look around and see many honest men who hide their beauty as best they can. I think that's what the whites hate. Our beauty, the way we carry the land and life of plants inside us, seedlings and fruit, flowers and the flushed tree, fields freed of weeds. Why can't they see the doors inside them? So, if someone found an answer to that, they would find an answer to why those who are hungry and cold go off to battle to become hungrier, colder, farther from home. Sometimes, Michiko, I think of my greenhouse. How I used to stand at night in its fleshy, steaming dark and say, these are the most beautiful orchids and roses in the world. And the fragrance seeped inside me, stayed even when I sold them. Forgive me. Blessed with the chance to talk to my wife, more beautiful than any greenhouse rose, all I can do is moan. And yet, if I didn't tell you, I would be angry at you for not listening, blaming you for what I haven't spoken. And it's too late for that. When you write back, please tell me what country I'm in. I feel so poor now. These words are all I own. So that was the first generation Japanese American. Issei, my grandparents' generation. This is called An Argument in 1942, and in it I'm sort of writing a poem describing how I think the time before internment was like. And then when it goes, no, 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 it's my mother speaking. And she's sort of arguing that I'm making too much of the internment. And she, like many Japanese Americans of her generation, didn't talk about these concentration camps. So this is called An Argument, 1942, for my mother. And again, when it's no, 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 it's her voice coming in. Near Rose's chop suey and Janosuke's grocery, the temple where incense hovered and inspired dense evening chants, prayers for Buddha's mercy, colorless and deep. That day he was fired. No, 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 she tells me. Why bring it back? The camps are over, also overly dramatic. Forget Shoyu stained Furoshiki mochi on a stick. You're like a terrier, David, gnawing a bone, an old trick. Mostly, we were bored. Women cooked and sewed, men played backjack, the gardens, the banjo. Who noticed barbed wire guards in the towers? We were children, hunting birds, stones, wildflowers. Yes, mother hid tins of sukemono and eel beneath the bed, and when the last was peeled, clamped tight, her lips growing thinner and thinner. but cancer, not the camps, made her throat blacker. And she didn't die then. After the war in St. Paul, you weren't even born. Oh, I know, it's all part of your job, your way, but why can't you glean how far we've come, how much I can't recall? David, it was so long ago. How useless it seems. This is called internment camp psychology, circa 1944-5, and family friend applied for a job after he got out of internment camps, and he had to answer a sort of psychological test as part of the job application. So this is it. Internment camp psychology, circa 1945. Just after his release, Moss took a psychological test. 3 questions he never forgot. Do you think people are out to get you? Do you feel you are being followed? When you see a crowd of strangers walking towards you, do you try to avoid them? To all 3, he answered yes, and knew he sounded insane. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. Let's now have Danny Nyugen coming back for his second set. Danny?
Yeah, actually, the piece is long enough that I'm actually going to divide it into 3. So that lightning round at the end, it's going to be the very last few paragraphs. So here's part 2. Where am I? I scrolled on ahead just to make sure that it was going to be good on timing. Okay, so the last thing I left off with was worked as a mental health care counselor. The cycle of abuse. Danae. And then there was Koi. I ended up with Koi probably the same way Danae ended up in all her turbulent situations. You meet a beautiful man, someone you think is out of your league, but he's charming, someone who is initially attentive to your needs, who makes you feel attractive. And then you start losing all the magical abilities that once made you powerful. He didn't start off abusive. In most toxic relationships, it happened over time after the honeymoon phase, when I was enthralled with how new and sparkling the romance was. What drew me to Koi was how familiar he felt. Like my own parents, his were also refugees from Vietnam, providing us with a common shorthand of mutual experiences. As children of immigrants, we could take turns swimming in each other's pool of double consciousness, sharing notes on our childhood to the point of completing each other's sentences. If you got a bad grade, instead of encouraging you to try harder, did your mother ever say, "I'll beat you to death"? Of course! Initially, Koi also made me feel wanted and vital, a sense of dizzying importance that distracted me from his attachment issues. Like Shannon Doherty in the made-for-TV movie Obsessed. And eventually, like Shannon Doherty, he began picking fights with me whenever I wanted to spend time with my friends. The first instance was when I made dinner plans without him. He sulked, then screamed because dinner was supposed to be our time, all the time, every night. In hindsight, I broke the seal by placating him then, giving into his demands instead of recognizing his outburst for what should have been obvious to any fan of Lifetime movies. A sign. The sign. The kind of sign that appears in the first 15 minutes of the film. But what choice did I have? We were offspring of people who were marked by displacement and war and trauma. Growing up, my father was prone to fits of violence that came out of nowhere, resulting in smashed coffee tables and sandals that flew at my face. Episodes that taught me how to appease his rage by accepting fault, making myself small and agreeable until I coaxed the peaceful version of my father back. And Khoi's father, a soldier of the fallen South Vietnamese army, survived a concentration camp after the war. He was forced to labor in the jungle, starved and tortured. And upon his release, Khoi's father fled his country by way of a tugboat drifting off into the Pacific Ocean, and then abandoned his family by way of a mistress. Though Khoi resented his father more than I resented my own, I imagined the man was so dehumanized I could see how romance with a strange woman would have been a selfish yet emotionally and physically healing experience. Still, this made Khoi skeptical and suspicious, fearful of desertion. And because of the coping mechanisms I learned from dealing with my own father, I offered Khoi the only thing I knew I could. I loved him. I tapped into all the empathy I had learned as a counselor. And when I saw Khoi reach for me as if I were a lone life raft at sea, even though I felt claustrophobic, it compelled me to reach back and cradle that small, damaged boy and make him happy. But once I woke up in the middle of the night to see him going through the text messages on my phone because he had become paranoid that I was secretly dating someone behind his back. Another time, I returned to my desk from a meeting at work to find 7 voicemails, each progressively more heated, cursing me out, accusing me of ignoring him because I clearly lied about going into the office that day. When I asked him to stop hacking into my email account, he threw all my clothes into a garbage bag and ejected it out the window of his apartment. Soon, Khoi was breaking up with me every other week, but without the clarity of a clean break, because his breakups were actually tests. He expected me to chase after him, apologizing for all my mistakes and misdeeds, begging him to take me back. If I didn't, he would accuse me of indifference that had been stringing him along this whole time, and it was obvious, and it was an obvious sign I never cared about him or the relationship to begin with. There's a scene in the made-for-TV movie, Mother, May I Sleep with Danger, where Tori Spelling's character is being held captive in a cabin by her homicidal boyfriend. "You drugged me," she slurs, waking from her torpor. "I love you," he responds, as if that's a direct answer to her accusation. "This is kidnapping," she says, to which he replies, "No, this is just a guy and a girl away on a romantic weekend, that's all." This exchange of cognitive dissonance reminded me of the incident phases of all my cycles with Khoi, when I would try to talk him down from his fiery state by stating the obvious. I was late coming home because the bus was running behind. I wasn't ignoring you. My phone died, so I couldn't text you back right away. I did not cut my palm open. You forcibly ripped the keys from my hand when you pushed me. But presenting facts doesn't always work. This is something that all counselors know. You can underscore all the known data, trying to contrast it with the paranoid thoughts of the unknown that a person might be hanging from a ledge by. But it's not up to you to decide for them how they must proceed. You should simply make yourself available and listen, validate their feelings, and hope for the best. The problem was I had become an over-validator who felt obliged to help people with misalignments, especially my lover, to stick by him no matter what. On one hand, I was motivated by a certain level of generosity. On the other hand, I too had become the disillusional boyfriend in the relationship. Scarcity can blind you, make your hopes impossibly elastic. I had never met another man like Khoi who shared my family's language and history. Perhaps queer people are not unlike refugees or immigrants ourselves, in that we're both in diaspora searching for our tribe, people who reflect us. We relish the rarity of another person who understands essential parts of who we are without words and without effort. because I found such a connection with Inkoi, I was too selfish and self-damaging to give him up. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could be that shining knight of force, stable enough to finally fix him. One of the most satisfying things about watching a Lifetime movie is the sense of superiority you feel as a voyeur, admonishing the protagonist through the TV screen for all their mistakes. What the hell, Melissa Joan Hart? Your ex-boyfriend isn't interested in you anymore. No, Danae, don't respond to that guy's advances if he's doing it behind his wife's back. If I had watched the way Koi shoved the made-for-TV movie version of myself down the stairs, I would have smugly shrieked, "Bitch, why'd you go back to him to begin with?" But I didn't need some meta-level perspective to recognize what was going on. I could hold my relationship up to the cycle of abuse diagram and graph the movement of his theory, and yet I stayed. I stayed because I thought I could right that ship. I stayed because I was convinced I had the skills and self-awareness as a counselor to steel myself to not be a victim. I stayed because I felt a need to forgive his refugee upbringing, to validate the fact that our people pass our trauma down through our veins so that for generations, our emotions come out sideways and wrapped in barbed wire. I wasn't Candace Cameron and no one would tell, I tried to assure myself. And yet there I was, not telling anyone what I was going through, not even Danae. I'll pause there and finish it in the next round.
That was great, Danny. Thank you so much. And we're looking forward to hearing the grand finale here in just a bit. Let's have our next reader in this second round, Annie Liu.
Okay. So I'm going to read 3 poems now from my book, which is coming out next year. It's called Border Vista. And I found out this January that it was going to be published. It's definitely one of the best things that's happened to me this year so far. I think closely, I'm going to say, that my bike has also given me about as much joy, to be able to go out into the world and go faster, see the city. So the 3 I'm going to read, they all feature my mother. It's been sort of interesting to go through the book and pull out poems that were written many years apart and see how they speak to each other. And I think this little cluster is sort of interesting in that way. The first one is Ars Poetica in a Dream Language. I dream my mother unravels hair out of my mouth. In English, she asks me to speak Chinese, coils the hair into a dark gloss whirled in her palm. Fluency, I can't unhear my Chinese memories in English. Does that make them American memories? The word ravel means the same thing as its opposite, to entangle or disentangle, render incoherent or make plain. And now in this dream, she leaves me to muddle her hair from my mouth, a thin silk slick with saliva, I render into shapes that look nothing like her. Once, but no longer, ravel meant to waste, spoil, or destroy a thing, as by pulling a fabric into threads. If we allow for obsolete meanings, then let me also go back in time to the original state, examine at length or in a hurry, because what is obscure becomes obsolete, leaving a thin trail of threads. When I look back, I see the path, hair dark and raveling. Someone mentioned in the chat that they were really enjoying all the different languages. So this next one It's so funny. I have this like urge to like share my screen, but that's not really the point. It is a poetry reading, at least my part of it. And so, but I've got some Chinese characters in here as well as pinyin. For someone who, like me, who can't really read Chinese characters without pinyin, I've been having a lot of fun including them in poems so that people who are sort of readers or people who are learning can know how they're pronounced. Xian Nocturne with Jasmine and Pears. I call my mother to tell her about a rare dream in the first language. The fruit vendor's miniature green pears, the soft juice I crave. She pays, but gets the wrong change. And I realize she can't read the words on the cardboard sign and doesn't know how much she is owed. She reminds me that the word for pear sounds the same as the word for leave. Li and Li. You're telling me I paid too great a price to leave, she says. Inflected differently, Li is Jasmine, my mother's namesake. How do I tell her that a week earlier, leaving my grandparents' home, an ambush of jasmine stopped me on the sidewalk? Small mouths, muted with grime, yet still sweet as a rain-dipped stone. I plucked one, tucked its velvet trumpet behind my ear. Now, half a world away, my mouth empties. Every word sounds the same. And the last one in this series, Ohio makes an appearance. I'm very Midwestern. Even in China, I was living in a Midwestern city. And this one, you've got a drainage ditch at its center. And that was a primary feature of my childhood in Bowling Green, Ohio, where these ditches drained the Great Black Swamp. Ditch. For a creek, I had the drainage ditch, dug behind the row of streets. In it, Mountain Dew bottles half full of piss, party balloons, tadpoles and toads, splinters of fish. Someone claimed they saw a turtle, and I spent a whole week wading against the current, shins slathered with leaves, looking and seeing instead a snake slip across a rock like rain. If you walk along the ditch's grassy banks from here, it will take you back to 2nd Street, then Scott Hamilton, the name a mystery to me for years, to those first places I called home in this country. One has a balcony that, when it was ours, held nothing but air. The one on 2nd is street level, shuttered, but I know what it's like inside. Nubby carpet that sandpapers bare feet, the walls damp with shower steam, and nothing ever dries. This place where I first learned to be scared of being alone, where I buried my first bird. The ditch will take you all the way back to my old elementary school, the track 8 loops of which make 1 mile, and the rusty hinges of the swings where, after school, no one as witness but the crows, my mother confessed she didn't know how to swing. So, if you saw us there, hurtling through the late fall day, gripping our chains, racing each other to the top, you would never guess it was me who taught her how to become your own engine of push and pull, how to give your body to air. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Annie. So we're now going to have our final round. Are you contestants ready? That was just we do a sort of a quick lightning round, final piece from all of our readers. And I believe first up, we will hear the conclusion of Danny's story.
Right. The end of after the honeymoon phase. It took me nearly 2 years to leave Koi, and during those 2 years, I learned how to buy a bouquet of flowers, each destined to wither and die, which I offered to him as apologies every time he judo flipped the situation by getting angry at me for getting upset at him to begin with. In most Lifetime movies, flashbacks that occur within the story happen in two ways. The character is floated back in time where they're inhabiting the body of their younger self as they re-experience the abuse. Or they're suddenly transported back to the incident, but the world is black and white and grainy, and they have to watch their younger self go through the abuse from the position of a helpless third-person witness. My flashbacks are much murkier, shapeless, silent. I don't find myself teleported back in time where the setting fills in around me. Instead, his voice will suddenly creep up from the southern corner of my mind while I'm babysitting my baby nephew or scanning a display of bananas at the grocery store. Soft at first, until it's loud enough to give me pause. The sprays of spit when he screamed, or the angry text messages I deleted from my phone after the fights to convince myself they never happened. We're gonna have a talk tonight, asshole. Or come pick up your shit on the sidewalk and go to hell. Sometimes I respond right in the middle of walking through a parking lot by letting out a long, heavy sigh, as if I'm pushing the bad memory as far out of my body as I can. Sometimes, as if my mind is at war with itself, I'll literally mutter words out loud under my breath. Shut up, I'll say, to which my confused nephew looks up from his Legos at me and shrugs. It's not quite l'esprit de l'escalier, but it's something. A ward, perhaps, attempting to shoo away images of kicked open doors or torn apart birthday presents and threatening messages scrawled into the dust that layered the windows of my car. A defensive posture towards the question of, why did I allow all this to happen? That fills me with embarrassment, self-pity, shame. A non-answer for all the times I should have fought back for myself but didn't. If Lifetime were to make a movie about me, it would be called Girl, You Don't Love Yourself, the Danny Nguyen story, starring Scarlett Johansson. The resilience of the protagonist in women in peril type of made-for-TV movies is probably the most important feature of their melodramas. The heroes are never killed, they fight back, they survive. Then peaceful piano music outro while the credits roll. But what happens to them after? When I was in that training on the cycle of abuse, our instructor Amanda asked the class, after breaking from this cycle, how long do you suppose it takes for the victim to recover from their experiences? One of my classmates raised her hand. Depends on the type of abuse and how long it lasted, she said. Another person said, depends on the support they receive afterwards. Danny, Amanda asked, what do you think? I didn't know how to respond then, and I don't know how to respond now. The answer is yet to find me. All right, that's it.
That was great. It was wonderful, Danny. Thank you. Next up is in the lightning round is Annie.
Right. Now I'm going to keep imagining Scarlett Johansson as Danny Nguyen from now on. My final poem that I'll read is on injury, and it's actually it's a big prose block that's all one sentence, and each section is sort of like indented further and further to kind of organize it a bit. Okay, let's see. I don't think I've read this out loud for a while. On injury. For most of the movie, I had been aware of my need to urinate, but even more aware of the entire row of people's laps I'd have to crab leg across to do so. So I stayed in my seat, putting other people's imagined discomfort ahead of my own bodily functions. But I also didn't want to miss any part of the movie that I was so eager to see, which was turning out to be a good one, despite the fact that I had managed to hurt my wrist right before from sporting with friends, knowing only the vaguest things about stopping the white ball when it came in my direction with, of all things, my forearms. And the wrist was swollen, hot, and bright pink. Anyone else might have stopped playing until several more hours worth of instructional YouTube videos had been viewed, which meant it would throb every so often, like when I shifted in my seat to get a clearer view, and kept me from holding hands with Y, which we often do when we watch movies, an act that helps someone like me with an overactive imagination to stay rooted to this life in this body. So when the movie was over and the lights went up, I rushed downstairs to the bathroom and, having relieved myself, came back up to find everyone dispersing into the cold evening. I love that feeling of emerging from a theater and into the now dark day, as if what we'd seen made it so. And we made our farewells to the friends who'd sat beside us for the last 2 hours and with whom we now shared the lives of those depicted on screen. The light on the actors' faces from the porch as they looked up into their night sky, empty of the fireworks they could hear but not see. The crunch in their mouths of korokke, deep fried to perfection. The final wrenching separation of the ad hoc but very real family. After which, Y and I walked back to the car, and I said something I didn't quite mean, like, how sad. And then tears that I hadn't realized I'd been holding were there, hot on my face, reminding me how strange weeping can be, how one injury becomes connected with others, and in our bodies can be metabolized and then released together, how witnessing fictive pain can activate our own dormant sensitivities. And now, 2 weeks later, the bruise I knew was there from the ball hitting my wrist has finally surfaced from the deeper tissue, as if it will eventually float up and through my skin into the air.
Thanks, Annie. And congratulations once again on the forthcoming book. We're looking forward to it. Our final reader for the lightning round, David Mura.
There's a show, Denny's piece mentions yellow-face casting, and he could have mentioned, besides Scarlett Johansson, Emma Stone. So this is a poem, Why Bruce Lee is Sad. And there's a TV show now called Kung Fu on CW, which has a Chinese-American woman as the lead. But there's another history to Kung Fu. When Bruce Lee was doing Green Hornet, after he got done doing Green Hornet, he thought of a series of a martial arts master wandering the Old West. But instead of making that TV show with Bruce Lee, they made it with David Carradine, a white actor who did the yellow face, had his eyes slanted up. And David Carradine had not studied martial arts. And so Bruce Lee left for Hong Kong and said, I can't make it here. He hit the glass ceiling, and which is a thing that is familiar to many Asian Americans. So also Bruce Lee's son Brandon was tragically killed on the set of The Crow. He was friends with Chuck Norris, and David Carradine eventually killed himself, self-asphyxiated himself in a sort of sexual ritual. So the prompt for this poem, I mean, this is a long preamble, but the people younger than me don't necessarily know the history of Bruce Lee in this. This comes from a New York Times article. Well, I'll read the portion of the article. Can a fish be depressed? This question has been floating around my head ever since I spent a night in a hotel across from excruciatingly sad-looking Siamese fighting fish. His name was Bruce Lee, according to a sign beneath his little bowl. Bruce Lee, totally still, his lower fin grazing the clear faux rocks on the bottom of his home. When he did finally move just slightly, I got the sense that he would prefer to be dead. So I decided to write this poem why Bruce Lee is sad. Because no one listens to fish. Because I could have swum in the deepest oceans and the coldest depths. Because I swam the deepest oceans and coldest depths. Because I pitched a show with a martial arts master wandering the West. Because I could have torn apart David Carradine with one hand blindfolded. Because David Carradine stole my kung fu. Because fish is a metaphor, and you in your bubble watching me in my bubble, an inscrutable alien for your denigration and delight. Because I wore a mask on Green Hornet when I slipped off my mask. Because Cato chauffeured Brett Reed and did his master's bidding. Because I could have kicked Van Williams's ass blindfolded with both hands tied. Because the melancholy of the fish is of far more interest than the suicide rate of Asian American women or depression in our men. Because I didn't hear the cheers in Harlem when I thrashed Chuck Norris. Because no one saw what I held back to make that fight seem even. Because Chuck Norris now stumps for Trump. Because my white wife's family disowned her. Because the martial arts world forbade my teaching Lofan or blacks. Because they bulleted my son Brandon on the set of The Crow. Because a fish cannot choose its colors nor its name. Because yellow is what they call a coward. Because the fight in a fish can't be measured by its size. Because when I swam back to Hong Kong, no one noticed. Because when I said, "Be water, my friend," this aquarium wasn't my dream. Because death stared from 1,000 mirrors, and no fist could smash all that glass ceiling. Because if you enter a dragon and come out a fish, you're surely a gook in America, where David Carradine, cursed and self-asphyxiated in a sexual ritual, isn't as sick as Chuck Norris, who once called me friend, now brain for a man who would ban me back to China to be stuffed in a fishbowl, looking as sad as this world has become. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, David. It's a wonderful piece to end on, too. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our readers this evening, Danny and David and Annie. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. We're going to have a final piece of music from Kyoko Kiramura, and then we'll have our question and answer section. If you have any questions for anyone tonight, feel free to put them in the chat. If you're watching there at home on Facebook Live, feel free to put them in the comment section and we'll find you there. Take it away, Kyoko.
It was a sound, a beautiful vibration in the air. Anonymous. That I loved. Then it grew an arm. Then it grew a thumb. It grew an elbow. Finally, a face. And I realized that I didn't love it anymore. sometimes. All I want is anonymous. A lovely sound without a face, because too much information, too many memories can kill the love. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyoko. That was fantastic. Again, I want to thank Kyoko Kiramura for being our musical guest this evening. So we're going to do, sorry, I'm just distracted by a question that came in, but I'll start with one that that I had, and I'll gonna try and kind of make it around to everyone. Danny? Oh,
Yes.
sorry, you were spotlighted there for a moment, but I think that's my fault. There we go. So the first question I had, I think I'll start with David. How have you handled, or how has the pandemic affected what you do, and has it affected your writing too? Not so much the process, but have themes come into your writing because of things like lockdown and viruses and that sort of thing?
I think, I'm one of those artists for whom the pandemic, on one level, because I'm an introvert, it was part of the socializing I don't miss. But I think the other thing that happened was, I'm from the Twin Cities, and the height of the beginning of the pandemic, George Floyd was murdered and there were demonstrations here. And so I've actually been working on an anthology of writers of color from Minnesota, and many of them are responding to the pandemic. So, when I think of this year, in certain ways, and at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, people are going to stop thinking about racial issues because of the pandemic. And with what happened with George Floyd and demonstrations, that obviously is not true. And then for Asian Americans, because of the stupid, racist, xenophobic, Trumpian rhetoric, and because of the general atmosphere of the Trump, administration, which really gave free rein. It said to a lot of white people, okay, you can be openly racist now, because your president is openly racist. And so we've seen this 150% rise in Asian American hate crimes. It's worse than it's ever have been, I think, in my lifetime. And I remember back to the 80s when there was that anti-Japanese sentiment and the killing of Vincent Chin. So for Asian Americans particularly, the pandemic is particularly disturbing because of all of this anti-Haitian hate. And it marks a place where it tells Asian Americans, you may think you're citizens of this country, but really, that citizenship can be taken away any moment. And so that the internment camps, what happened is internment camps was not an exception. It was an illustration of a rule about how Asian Americans are regarded, which is our state in America is determined a large part in due to whatever relations America may be having with countries in China. And at any moment, we can revert to the Orientalist terrorist, the Oriental threat, the Oriental pestilence, which is what we're experiencing during this past year.
Thanks, David. Annie, how have you fared over the past year or so? How have things changed for you, or how have you coped with it?
Yeah, I think in some ways I've been thinking about my own writing as coming out of an impulse to be with, right? A kind of longing to kind of experience something that to be sort of transported in a sense. And I think being on lockdown intensified that. And, you know, I think in many ways I felt very privileged in this past year because I've, you know, kept my job. I have had consistent access to healthcare. I didn't need to be, you know, out there working in a physical space. And at the same time, I think about how much, you know, I've been really sort of inspired by the ways that community has happened virtually and in person too, in some ways. But I think about just how much work and sort of creative community, how much that's so important. And so for me, I start to feel kind of like disembodied after weeks of really not being with the people who, you know, you're creating with and creating for. And so I miss that very much. I'm really looking forward to being able to be with others in real space and to just, you know, share the air, literally. I think so much of this year has been about breath, about, you know, whether that's related to Black Lives Matter or to the pandemic or to suddenly like you know, the particles of our breath becoming so, we've become so aware of them and how they can infect each other, the sort of porousness that is, I think, sort of what's inherently really beautiful about community, becoming sort of dangerous too. Yeah, I'm also based in the Twin Cities now, but I'm very new to it. And so, and last spring, like right before George Floyd was murdered, I was in sort of I had moved to like a small town with my partner to spend the summer. And so I missed a lot of the uprisings in the city, but I'm really curious. I guess I have my own question for everyone on the panel, but also especially for David about just this feeling of like, you know, how things feel here and in where you are all living, you know, in this year and sort of in your communities. And I'm curious about, about how that's changed. I think that insight about this being the worst, maybe even worse than things were in the 80s, is really interesting to me. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Annie. I had commented to someone, I think not too long after lockdown, I thought the solitude was fantastic. The isolation after a certain point, you really, it feels less like solitude and feels more like isolation. Personally, Kyoko, I wanted to ask you as a musician, because I know the performing arts have really been hit hard. So I wondered how you've been dealing with things over the past year. Are things picking up? Are you starting to perform in person again?
Well, I can speak from two different levels. I'm sorry, there's still reverb on it, so I'm sorry about that. First, because I was the executive director of a nonprofit arts organization until the end of last month. So it's just been a few days that I've left. But what happened is I used to run the organization still exists. I resigned, but I was running an organization for a composer named Anthony Braxton, and we had prepared a whole year of celebration because it was his 75th birthday. So when the pandemic hit last May, we were just about to go to a tour of multi-day event at a festival called Big Ears. And then all of a sudden it's force majeure. You know, that's the one word, F-O-R-C, force majeure. It just, you know, all the contracts are gone, and then all the concerts are gone. So really in a blink of an eye, we lost a year of performances, right? And it's basically a performance arts organization, and we also have archives and scores of Anthony Braxton. So we really had to stop and say, okay, what are we going to do? Because an entire year, our performances take anywhere from like 8 months to 3 years to produce and to negotiate the contracts and all that, and it was gone. And then we decided that we were going to just focus on what we could do, and and which was basically the archive, because we have 33,000 pages of Anthony Braxton's material, which other people would want to play, and they did play online, so we were able to keep up visibility. But when we pivot like that, there are, we have donors, so there's the consideration of how to stay visible, and PR and publicity, and how we're going to pivot that. So it's an entire organization that had to change, and then also restructure so it could run without an executive director, so that I could leave. And we just kind of finished that. And it was a year-long effort by everybody. We all worked together. And it's Tricentric Foundation, which is the organization, is in great shape right now to weather the rest of the pandemic. Now, we are starting, I say we, but Tricentric and also myself separately as an artist, I am starting to get work in terms of recordings. But in terms of performing, and Europe is basically where we often like to go, because we can go do festivals, and that's also, you know, there's a financial aspect to why we want to go to festivals where it usually pays a lot better. But right now the consideration is insurance, COVID cancellation clauses, what is going to happen to the contract that will protect the musicians. All this is still up in the air, and the travel requirements to go to Europe is just very, very murky right now. So I think it'll take a while. You know, New York City right now, so many people are vaccinated like me. I had my second dose of Moderna. We are starting to be able to come together in real life and rehearse. As a vocalist, I am still very careful, because anything I do might spread aerosol. So I'd rather be in an ISO booth if we're recording. But then, you know, I talk to my friends in like Australia or Japan. And Japan, for example, they're not vaccinated yet. So there's just no way I could even enter the country, right? And I think that's a question I have for all of you here, the panelists, especially if you have family in other parts of the world. How are you dealing with that? Because I can't go to Japan right now. So that's one question that's I have for everybody. I don't know if that answered your question, Tony, but that's been what's happening on the performing arts front in terms of how I'm dealing with things.
That's great. I know it's, it's been different for different performing arts, especially places that are attached to a venue has been really, really difficult. And yeah, it's, trying to fill a house that you can't physically fill, trying to work out the economics of, well, we could open, but we can only have 25% capacity or that sort of thing. So it's just not even worth it. I wanted to ask Danny, a question came in on Facebook. Who would play Coy if Scarlett Johansson would play you? Who would play Coy?
Oh my gosh, who would play Coy? Who would play my abusive ex that I wrote about in that essay? Well, I mean, I'm partial to John Cho. I love John Cho. I got a crush on him. I probably sent a lock of my hair somewhere. There's probably a Patronus somewhere in my room. But I did say, the one thing about, my former partner was that he was beautiful and damaged. And I think John Cho is capable of playing that character. Yeah, I don't know. Also, I don't know if Hollywood were to do it, they'd probably whitewash him too. I am actually, no, you know who I want to play Coy in the made-for-TV movie version of me is the animation of Tuk Tuk, the roving caterpillar giant bug in the new Raya film, Raya and the Last Dragon. That thing is so cute. But then again, I'm also kind of a chub chaser. So yeah, let's say Tuk Tuk.
That's great. Now I had kind of a hybrid question because someone in the chat asked about how has your Asian identity affected your writing, and I wanted to kind of add to that. I heard Dinesh Smith give a craft talk recently, excuse me, and he said that for him there's a difference between writing to Black people and writing for Black people. And when he walks into a room, he very much knows, or he does not necessarily size up, but it changes. It's a different tone. And so I wonder, we'll start with Annie. In a compositional or in a performance or reading sense, where are your sensibilities as far as to or for an audience?
That's a great question. Something that I actually have struggled with. I feel like that's something they asked us in grad school, is like, who's your audience and who are you writing for and why? And at that point I had answered, oh, for my younger self, or for a version of my younger self, for the poems that I would have wanted to read growing up. And I think that's true to a degree. And I think that if I have to, I think maybe instead of 2 or 4, maybe for me, it's hoping to be more with. And there's that sense of sort of, David mentioned Persimmons by Li Young Lee. That was a poem that I think was the first poem by a Chinese American poet that I ever read. It was in my Norton anthology, this massive tome with Bible onion paper. And it was I think it was the last poem. So it was the newest one. They organized it chronologically. And so there was this astonishment at seeing that poem there, what it was about, what it was doing, but also just how moving it was and how clearly how it staked out its spot in that book. So I think when I'm writing hopefully in response to all those poems and to the work that's out there. I think this is such an incredible time to be a writer, and for me in particular to be a Chinese American writer, and also an docu-poet. I feel like there's so much sense of I am in company, I have that there's this vast chorus of voices who are doing all kinds of interesting and strange and beautiful things. So maybe that will be my answer for now.
That's great. That's great. Kyoko, let me ask you kind of the same thing. Do you feel like who is your audience, and do you feel that your audience changes? Does it change depending on your physical location, or does it change in the compositional sense?
For me, there's the audience in the audience, as well as the musicians I work with, because I also work in an ensemble. So there's I would definitely think about the musicians that I would be performing with if I'm writing something. And then there's also a difference between how much improvisation is included in my piece or not, because improvisation is actually an invitation. It's an invitation for the performer to make their own decisions, right? So how much of this opening that I want to give to these people who will be making music with me and who will be making music with me great, if I somehow I'm able to create a situation for them to be great. So I'm all constantly thinking about how to make other people great in the ensemble. So there's that. And then there's the audience. And with the audience, what I write will probably not change at all. I think there was a question in the chat about how my musical styles came to be, but there's I have a double profession, so I was a journalist for many years, and I often did cover crisis, and then in the crisis situation, I'm very reactive, right? Because there's no control. Control is an illusion to begin with. And then if you have kids, in a very positive way, we also don't have control, right, over our lives. And I learned early on, I think, that we don't have control. And in music, that's what I enjoy, that the surprises that other people bring me, the surprises, even if it's like an audience phone ringing, that's okay with me. These are the surprise moments where people's vulnerabilities open up to accept new experiences. So that's something I'm conscious about, but my writing does not change with the audience, but it will definitely change with who I think I might be improvising with.
That's great, thanks. And that's actually, I hadn't really thought about that when I asked you the question too, the fact that you are part of ensembles. And so you're always, it's not just you're part of a group. And so you're always lead support, you're always, and sometimes both, but there's a lot of give and take there. David, let me ask you kind of the same question. I'm kind of filtering through the chat too, so I might have a follow-up question for you too.
Well, my first thought is to problematize that question, because in Playing in the Dark by Toni Morrison, it's called Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination. She makes the point that until recently, white American authors wrote without thinking of a Black reader. And many of them still continue to do so. In my book, Stranger's Journey, where I talk about race and identity, I have an essay called The Four Questions of the Narrator. Who is the narrator? Whom is the narrator telling the story to? When is the narrator telling the story? And why is the narrator telling the story to? And oftentimes writers of color think that they have to tell the story to a white middle-class audience. And they don't. And in the same way that in Heart of Darkness, Kurtz is telling a story to, not Kurtz, Marlowe is telling the story to a group of English, professionals on a yacht. That's the group he's telling the story to. In The Brief Wondrous History of Oscar Wilde, Junot Diaz is telling the story to Dominicans of his generation. And so he doesn't translate the Spanish, and he doesn't explain references. That's the audience that he's telling the story to. And so as a writer of color, you can tell the story, whatever the piece you're writing, to anybody. You can tell it to your mother, right? Or you can tell it to your sister or your lover. And then other people have to figure things out. And sometimes they don't want to do that. That's fine. The other thing I would say is that when Miss Saigon came out, originally, I had arguments with white artist friends over the yellow-face casting and the Orientalism in that stupid musical. And I eventually wrote about these arguments because they led to the breakup of many friendships with a lot of white artists I know who at the time did not understand why I found white-face casting so objectionable. Of course, today, none of those white artists would get up on stage and argue for yellow-face casting, right? But at the time, once I wrote the article about it, people wrote me and said, have you become a racial separatist? And what I understood is the things that I was saying to them that were making them angry were the exact same things I was saying at college campuses. And afterwards, Black students, Latinx students, Asian American students, and Native students would come up to speak with me. And I realized I couldn't speak to both audiences at the same time. And so part of, I think, one of the things about, and I tell this to younger Asian Americans, is that there's a certain portion of white culture you just have to get out of, stop bowing down to, and not really give a swear word to what they think. And so, who I'm writing to depends on the genre. Sometimes I am writing like about race to explain things to white people, right? Sometimes I'm writing things to Asian Americans, sometimes I'm writing things for myself. And you can choose any of those depending on the piece.
That's great. When I heard Dinesh Smith talk about it, he was speaking, I think, specifically about a classroom situation where he said if he walks in and sees a classroom full of Black children, he's not going to read Dear White America because they don't need to hear that. I mean, he can get everybody wound up on it if he wanted to, and that's fun for everybody, but he would rather do something that he feels like they need to hear, or that they, so Danny, let me kind of ask you the same question. I also wanted to jump back a little bit and ask you about, I know you're a major performer, obviously, and do a lot of stage work and own the stage. Are you able to own the Zoom screen? How has adapting to online performing, have you adapted, and how has that worked out for you?
That's a really interesting question. First off, I just wanted to offer a feedback, which is Dinesh Smith is a friend of mine, and they use they them pronouns. So just put that out there. But yes, I actually just spoke with Dinesh Smith recently, who gave me wonderful feedback, encouraging me to wear my hair down in my curls. So, anyways, so that's why you see me in this state right now. And so as far as like performing, obviously, yes, I play. When I do readings, I typically will dramatize the voice of the characters, just because I don't know. When I was younger, I bounced from like artistic medium to artistic medium. So it was like, first it was music, then it was like theater, then it was like dance, then I settled into writing in college. And part of it, like part of the performer's like attitude about like entertaining the audience on the stage never really left me. So in a lot of ways, I write purely for the prose, but I think early stage of my writing career, I also wrote with the understanding that I might have to perform it live, or I might have to like read them live. And there's something to be said about like the difference between like which kind of reader do I want to be. I made an early decision when I started developing my live reading skills that I didn't want to be the kind of writer who maybe talks like Saul Williams and does this. I don't know, like that's like embarrassing to me. No tea, no shade to anybody who does that. And then also I just didn't want to be like the kind of like dry reader who goes around like on my first like book tour, just like perhaps like knocking people out, because I'm definitely afraid that I'm not interesting enough. So there's the reason for that. But as far as like the Zoom thing, I mean, it's really interesting. I'm going to go back to like some queer theory here. In drag or in like queer performance, there's something called like serving face. And what that means is you should be able to glamorize and present yourself and seduce people into the fantasy of the persona that you're trying to present in the ballroom scene with just your face. And so to a certain degree, I think, the Zoom performance, yeah, I'm already gesticulating while I'm talking here. So clearly I haven't exactly exercised all of that out of my body. But I think that there's something to be said about like, if you're a writer and you're trying to adapt to Zoom readings, like number one, make sure that your drag is on point, because sometimes being able to perform on Zoom means that you have to dress the part, like dress for the job that you want. So when I do readings, whether it's for like the literary crowd, in this case, you folks, I am actually wearing slacks and a shirt. When I'm doing readings for like, say, in the kink community, for like the literary kink crowd, I'm actually like wearing my leathers and my gear and my like S&M gear. So I'm putting my body in a place where I'm inhabiting the persona or the type of reader that I want to be. And that's something that maybe like I feel like you hear a lot of like Zoom stories now where people are going into meetings, but they're only in drag from like the waist on up. Underneath, they're in their panties and like sweats. I was like, I don't know if that like puts me in the right headspace to actually perform and do a good job being the kind of entertainer I want the audience to receive. So
that's great. Do you want to talk a bit about the kind of the Dinesh question about two or four? You touched on that a little bit, but
yeah. So so the question is, who am I writing for? Am I writing for a specific audience? Am I writing for myself? Am I doing
performing or reading?
Or performing?
Like there's yeah.
That's actually a really interesting question, because I feel like only recently so the essay that I shared, that I read, was a pivotal moment in my writing career, because that relationship was actually part of a period in which I stopped writing for 7 years. I went to the Indiana University MFA program. I was writing high, like before I even got there. Like I was already publishing in journals. I was in an artist collective. I went to IU simply just to get my education and like this terminal degree so I could potentially teach. Once I left, it was the recession. I was going through a divorce. And then that propelled me into that abusive relationship in which I stopped writing. So it was like really, really, I spent a few years like just not producing any new work. So when I came out of it, I had a lot of anxiety and a lot of like insecurities around the kind of voice I wanted to get back to, whether or not I could even go back to the old voice that I used to have, whether or not I could even write and it made sense. Could I even connect with an audience? It wasn't until like maybe about a few years ago that I got like my first fellowship, first with Kundimon, then with like Lambda, then with VONA, which, David is part of. And each one of these successes kind of encouraged me along to say like, oh, your writing is actually makes sense at the very least. And then it wasn't until like the last 2 years that I got a grant from the San Francisco Art Commission that allowed me to like write full time, along with I now have a Patreon. So I actually have like people who have read my stories and my essays who are supporting me directly and allowing me to continue writing full time without having to like rely on a salary job. And each one of these little validations, whether it's from audiences going into my direct messages on Instagram, or people who are emailing me because they read a piece in like a journal, or even like all of a sudden I'm getting like a new Patreon supporter who like read one of my work and says, I really want to continue supporting this. The more that happens, the more. It wasn't until like the last year that I realized I was like, I'm starting to write more like how I want to sound, or how I naturally speak and think and break down ideas and articulate my stories in person. Then I'm becoming more like that natural writer than what I feel was a version of what I thought a writer should sound like. So does that make sense? Like, I guess what I'm saying is, who am I writing for? I think at first there was a point where I wrote for an audience that I felt like I had to hold their hand to translate certain things, like, oh, this is what my experiences are like as like a queer Southeast Asian kinkster. And then over time, I was like, I felt like I didn't have to hold the audience's hand. I can actually like tap dance a lot faster. And I'm finding that the more I trust that voice, the more the audience is willing to dance along with me.
No, that's great. I'm always interested in stories of patronage in the arts. Like, how do people make a living? How do they get paid? Because it's, you don't have a king supporting you anymore, that sort of thing. It's a little more, it's very individualized. So you got to, everyone's story of how they make it is a little different. So.
Yeah. And I gained that, I gained my experience around like Patreon and like, and navigating the like fellowships and like grant writing circuit purely from other independent artists who are working in other mediums that I really admire. Like, I got on Patreon because a musician who I deeply respect, she made a really great argument for like the way artists are surviving in our capitalist structure is broken. Gone are the days where you could have like a king or a institution completely say, here we go, you're a pet, now produce the work, now bring us some notoriety. But yeah, I'm like, because of social media, because of the internet, and because really like, I would say I am fortunate to have generations of audiences who are deeply empathetic that if you give your audience an opportunity to support you, they will.
That's great. That's a great point to make. Definitely. I think we have time for one more, and I want to ask this one. I want to again ask this one of everyone. So David touched earlier on this sort of. I mean, there's always been a certain amount of, we talked about yellowface and anti-Asian hate and hate crimes, and kind of the wave that was fomented by the Trump administration, and we're still seeing lingering remnants of that, and it doesn't go away overnight. And so I wanted to ask, how has your work, how have you contextualized that in your work, and are there aspects of things that you had already made or already written that have been recontextualized because of anti-Asian hate? Are there things that have taken on new meaning or have new subtext going on because of something that's happened, either directly or indirectly? And Kyoko, can we start with you?
Sure. So the piece you heard today was actually inspired by the fact that I think this is a moment where we are all more politicized, and we are all more thinking because of the events of who we are as Asian American and the question of identity. And so that piece was definitely inspired in part by asking who I am, and also the correspondence I had, email correspondence I had with David when David, you asked me which generation I am, and then I had to stop and think, because I was born in the States but raised in Japan, and then I worked in France and all that, and I'm like, what generation am I? And so this question of identity is something that's, I think, because of all the politicizing that's happening right now as Asian Americans, it's a moment that we can think about. And not so much in my work yet, but I would often, for example, if I'm touring with somebody, I would often not be thought of as a band member, and certainly not as an executive director. I'd be like the admin person, or for some reason they would always ask me, "Are you a violinist?" So these questions that come up, probably because they are stereotyping me as an Asian female. Up until very recently, I was like, okay, that's going to happen all the time anyway. I shouldn't dwell on it. But then it's right now at this point, I'm like, maybe there's a collective way to push back on this if we can work together. So that's where I am now. But then I'm also thinking that, Asian American is a word. We're not a monolith. How do we bring each other together is a big question. So I have more questions than answers, and also the narrative that the media is portraying. Like in New York City, we've had Asian, brutal violence. And as bad as it is, for example, the more recent, I believe there was a Vietnamese man attacked, right? That hasn't gotten as much attention in New York City. And maybe it's because it hasn't happened in New York City. But also, as a former journalist, I kind of think of what is the narrative that the media is presenting, and if that has an effect on how we are reacting. And I think it's important to question these things and not just trust the media. Not that I'm saying that it's not false news, but so all these, there are more questions than answers. And in how it has in the past manifested in my music is that I did stop using words, because for me, growing up, multilingual, words were a way to exclude. So for the longest time, I would not use words, but syllables or broken up words, which I am rethinking, because English is the way that the Asian Americans are coming together. And I am thinking about that very deeply. And I have a feeling that I will go back to writing lyrics, and maybe more about the merman. So that's where I am right now.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. David, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just want to remark on what Kyoko just said, because I think you should look at your three languages as an advantage rather than a box keeping you in, right? And the fact that you speak these three languages, that's just part of your identity. That's who you are. You know, there are Hmong Americans who speak Hmong, English, and French, right? Because there are a lot of Hmong in France. I mean, you know, this idea that we American, we aren't monolingual. We have all these different, my kids went to a school that had 35 different languages in it. That's America now, right? And we should celebrate that. That's our creativity. That's the way the culture keeps moving forward. With the anthology I'm working on, Writers of Color here in Minnesota, we had, I wrote an essay at the end after we got done with everything because of the anti-Asian hate crimes, that we realized that we needed an essay in the anthology to do that. I'm also working on this documentary. Here in Fort Snelling, there's an old fort which was established, you know, to invade native lands in the 19th century. And during World War II, it housed Japanese American, a Japanese school for military intelligence service. And because there were very few Caucasians, white people who spoke Japanese, America needed the Japanese American population because they were the ones who attended this school. Among them, my uncle was one of these people who attended the school. And so they fanned out all across the Pacific. And MacArthur's chief of intelligence, General Willoughby, said that they shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved probably 1 million American lives. Now, it's not common knowledge that these Nisei second generation linguists contributed probably more than any group of soldiers in the Pacific War. And while many of them at the same time, their families were interned in concentration camps. And one of them says in the documentary, says, like, after a certain point, I thought, I'm in military intelligence service. They're trusting me to be, you know, part of the intelligence units of the United States Army, and yet they don't trust my parents and my brothers and sisters. Now, when we started this documentary, we knew we were going to do it and include some of the things about, and I'm working as a co-producer, co-narrator, and narrator and writer. Obviously, with the rise in Asian American hate crimes, this is so relevant because, as I said earlier, it's this failure. It was a failure to distinguish between Japan, the nation, and Americans of Japanese descent, and they did not do this to the Italian American or German American population. And yet, this exact cultural background, which made them so suspicious, was a huge asset to the United States military during World War II. So, and then finally, I want to just refer, when Danny mentioned queer performance aesthetics, you know, one of the things I feel like being Asian American is a little like discovering that you're gay, because you don't generally grow up with gay culture. But once you come out and you discover who you are, you discover, like, there's this whole culture, there's this whole history that I didn't grow up knowing about. In certain ways, there's a slight parallel to Asian American, because I look at Asian America as it's a question. It's a series of questions about identity. And it involves two things. One, it involves what it means to be sort of bicultural in some sort of way. Now, if you're a 7th or 8th generation Chinese American, there's not a lot of Chinese culture probably in your family still. If you immigrated from some country in Asia last year, there is a lot. But beyond that, it is, what does it mean to exist in a body like mine and go out and interact in American society? How people react to you, how people think of you. But it's not just that, it's also how I think about myself. Because we as Asian Americans, we grow up generally in a culture where we don't see faces that look like us. Danny's having to go through all these white actresses to find correlatives. It's because there wasn't a John Cho, there wasn't an Aquafina, when we were growing up, right? And so we go, oh, that person is like me. There wasn't any Wong doing Boogie, a basketball movie of an Asian American basketball player, when I was growing up. So this question of Asian America, rather than thinking of it like this box you have to put yourself in, to me, it's a door, you open it up, and suddenly there's all this freedom. And there's a bunch of questions which will lead you on your own journey to figuring out who you are. And it's not a prescriptive journey, it's a descriptive journey, and it's interior as well as exterior.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, David. Yes, Danny, with your hand up.
Yeah. I did want to respond kind of directly to what David was saying. Can you hear me? Okay. I think one of the really important things to note about Asian American identity is also the fact that it is a loosely fitted community made out of multiple ethnic groups, like countless ethnic groups, of which have their own unique language, and how they arrived in America is radically different too. Like, I think one of the things I don't identify as Asian American so much as I identify as Southeast Asian American, and it's because the ethnic groups that I most identify with, the Vietnamese, the Thai, the Hmong, the Lao, the Cham, the Mien, like these are ethnic groups, Cambodians, like these are ethnic groups that only started, their American identities didn't start existing or being invented until the mid-70s at the earliest, realistically the 80s if we're thinking about it. So in terms of like ethnic enclaves that exist and are able to build community, this is one of the reasons why like Southeast Asian Americans have a higher poverty rate and level of dropping out of public education than other Asian ethnic groups. And so it's really interesting when you're trying to like build solidarity and community with other ethnic groups, in which maybe like it takes several generations in before people start identifying with a more pan-Asian American identity. Otherwise, you're especially if you're an immigrant, you only identify with people who you speak the same language and share the same culture with. I'm going to tie this back in really quick with like Black Lives Matter, because I think I identify my liberation and my community's like experiences around bringing refugees with Black solidarity. And it's because people like Muhammad Ali came out and said, my conscience won't let me shoot my brother, or some darker people, or some people, poor people hungry in the mud for a big, powerful America. Why should I go to Vietnam? How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail. It is literally like alumni of the Black Panther movement who said, you guys, the US government caused this mess. You owe it to let in the refugees. And so, I think that's one kind of complicated aspect of building Asian American identity, is also recognizing where does it cohabitate and cross-pollinate with other forms of liberation. And I bring this up also because, Officer Tao, one of the 4 officers involved in the assassination of George Floyd last summer or last year, he's Hmong. And I think it's really easy for a lot of people to look at him and go like, oh, like Asian American culpability and like, what is it called? Participation in the brutalization of Black bodies. Complicity. Thank you very much, Anna. Appreciate it. Thank you. And I say, yes, that is true. Asian Americans have a history of being complicit in the oppression of other Black and brown bodies. and simultaneously Officer Tao's like entry into like militarism and policing is not created in a vacuum. He's Hmong. Like to just assume that he is blanketed Asian American is to obliterate the complicated ways in which the Hmong were, as an indigenous group of Southeast Asia, were used by the US government, kind of the way that we trained like Al-Qaeda to fight secret wars. And so of course, there's a history of someone like Officer Tao who has a relationship with American paramilitarism and policing of other bodies because it is woven into their relationship with America's global imperialism. So yes, I think that's one thing that we got to also recognize is that every single Asian ethnic group has its complicated relationship to greater issues of American racial politics. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Annie, I'd like to get a final word from you, if you would. So we've ranged pretty far with this one question, but it's basically, you know, anti-Asian sentiments and hate crimes, and your identity as an artist, navigating that.
Yeah, I feel like we've had like 3 awesome mic drops, and so I will try to deliver my own. I think to me, the work or the aspect that I try to interrogate the most in my work is whiteness and internalized racism. And this, I think, related to the model minority myth is assimilation. So that to me, it's, and all of that is tied up around shame and around, you know, alienation and otherness and solid and isolation, I think, which David had touched on. Like when I came to the US, I first came to a really small town in Northwestern Ohio, and I was the only, I think I was the only Chinese student in my school. And I soon became best friends with someone who was half Korean. So in some ways, I think I felt very isolated by being sort of othered so immediately and having to learn English and having to sort of, you know, very quickly sort of assimilate into my new surroundings. But then as I look back on my life and think about who are the people who have been closest to me, actually a lot of them have been, you know, other Asians in America or other Asian Americans or other people of color. And, you know, so I feel like in many ways, I sort of held my sort of racialized shame very close to my chest for a really long time. And it wasn't until I started, and in college, I found out that I was actually in the country illegally, that my mother and I had overstayed our visas. And so now we were undocumented. And that just like, you know, if I was ever in the verge of like finding community and feeling good about exploring sort of not so much Asianness, but whiteness, right? And how that had affected my life and taken up so much oxygen. Finding that I was undocumented, I feel like really shoved things back underground. And suddenly I was really motivated by fear again. But once I was in grad school and had found other writers, including Filipina writers, other Asian Peruvian writers who were addressing this really openly, directly in their work, and then also meeting with other undocumented students in Bloomington, Indianapolis, I started to realize like, okay, well, unless someone is out here talking about this, I wouldn't have found them. And I wouldn't have found this sense of like, you know, belonging with them. And so it became sort of part of my work. I wanted to talk about it. I think in my poetry, it's really not addressed very directly. I have a really hard time addressing political issues sort of head on, or sort of politicized issues, I guess I should say, head on. But I think that so much of the work that we do is sort of around the writing and in what happens in these kinds of spaces, for instance, the things that we're able to say to each other because of what the work opens up. So yeah, that, I think to me, like the writing has really shifted something in my relationship with that shame. And so that's been profoundly healing and something I find transformative and something to invest in. Like Danny, I feel like that so much of what I've learned about liberation comes from, in particular, from queer Black feminist thinkers and writers, whether that's Afrofuturism or emergent strategy, sort of like what we pay attention to and what we practice, it grows. And so I'm hoping, as we embody the relations and sort of the world that we want to see, that I'm hoping that we'll get there.
Great, thanks, Annie. I think that will do it. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic, wonderful conversation, everyone. So glad you could all be here and join us. Thank you to David Mura, to Kyoko Kiramura, to Annie Liu, and Danny Nyugen. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I also want to thank our behind-the-scenes folks, Kyle Kloss, Hiromi Yoshida, Joan Hawkins. Thanks to everybody for being here, for joining us this evening. We will be back next month, Wednesday, June 2nd, right here on Zoom and Facebook Live at 6 o'clock Eastern, when we will have, let's see if I can remember, Ken Yoshikawa, poets Ken Yoshikawa, Adam Henze, and Sarita Goods, and music by our favorite local bard, Travis Puntarelli. So I'm going to close out the Facebook Live here momentarily, and but folks should feel free to hang with us for a bit on the Zoom. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and keep washing your hands, keep wearing a mask. I'm glad you've all got your shots, but we're not out of it yet. But we'll be together soon. We'll be together again soon. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you all.
I think we
Have a good
just
night.
I think we just unmuted. Could we have an audible clap for everybody, please? Yay! It was fantastic. It was fantastic.